7 million people pass through the Vatican every year. They walk the marble floors, they tilt their heads back to catch the sweep of Michelangelo's dome, and they crowd around Bernini's bronze. They're looking at the surface, the Renaissance, the high-gloss power of the church. But they are standing on a lie of omission. Because beneath that polished floor, deep within the humid, tomb-like atmosphere of the Vatican grottoes, lies a foundation that contradicts everything we are told about this hill. We are going to walk through those stone tunnels today, not to look at religious artifacts, but to look at the engineering. And what we find down there is an architectural impossibility that refuses to be ignored. You see, the Vatican claims its structures are just a timeline of the church, starting with the Roman necropolis of the 1st century. That is the official story. It is a tidy, linear narrative. But there is a massive, gaping problem: the stone itself. When you descend into the scavi, the excavations, you leave behind the brick and mortar of the Roman period and hit something that feels alien to the site. We're talking about massive, megalithic limestone blocks, precision-fitted without a single drop of mortar. To understand why this is a scientific headache, you have to look at how Romans built. They were the masters of opus cementitium, a volcanic concrete that allowed them to build fast and cheap. They filled molds with rubble and volcanic ash, and they got big, stable structures. That is the Roman way. But here is the thing. The foundation of the Vatican isn't concrete. It is dry stone, geometric precision work. These blocks weigh tons, and they are aligned with a mathematical confidence that echoes sites like Baalbek in Lebanon, or the foundations of Cusco in Peru. You simply do not build a small 1st century tomb by hauling 10-ton monolithic blocks from a quarry and carving them into perfect right angles. It is a waste of time and energy that makes no logistical sense. This is a clash of timelines. The church was built on top of a hill that had clearly been conquered, leveled, and repurposed long before the first Christian was ever buried there. Now, I need to back up for a second. How do we know this? In February 1939, Pope Pius XI died. The Vatican needed a space for him in the grottoes, a layer directly beneath the current basilica. They began clearing out a section that had been largely sealed off for centuries. The workers, the Sanpietrini, weren't archaeologists. They were just maintenance crews. They expected to find loose dirt, maybe some broken pottery, and the standard messy ruins of an old Roman cemetery. They started digging, and they hit a wall. And this wasn't just a wall. It was the red wall. It sits deep in the substructures, acting as a massive support. When the engineers examined it, they realized something was wrong. The construction technique of the red wall didn't match the surrounding Roman brickwork. The mortar used, the way the bricks were fired, the precision of the binding, it predated the rest of the necropolis by centuries. They were digging, and the ground was literally showing them 2 different civilizations in the same square foot of dirt. The workers were confused. They stopped. The excavation slowed to a crawl, because they realized they weren't just digging into the history of the church, they were digging into the bones of the hill itself. And honestly, this is the moment the official script cracks. Why, if this were merely a standard Roman cemetery, is there a massive megalithic foundation block system sitting at the base? It suggests that the Vatican isn't the origin of the sacredness on this hill. It's the inheritor. The site was already engineered, already set up, and already powerful before the Romans arrived. When you look at the photos from the 1939 dig, you don't see triumphant archaeologists. You see men staring at a riddle they cannot solve. They found something that shouldn't be there, and that is exactly why the full scope of what is down there has stayed behind closed doors ever since. We are told the story of the church, but we are effectively prevented from investigating the foundation. If you were to walk the line where the Roman brick meets that older megalithic stone, you would see it instantly. The Romans were building on top of something they didn't create, and likely didn't even understand. The deeper you go into the Vatican, the less sense the building makes. The architectural hierarchy is inverted. The most refined, the most impossible, The most permanent work is at the very bottom, and the further up you go, the more the construction relies on standard, decaying materials. It is a building that acts like a mask. The Vatican is layered, and the bottom layer is a forgotten story. We are left with an unresolved question that the Church never addresses. If the Vatican was built on foundations that predate the Roman Empire, who truly leveled this hill first? And why does the history of that engineering continue to be locked away from the light? Every year, 7 million people flood into Vatican City. They tilt their heads back, staring at Michelangelo's dome until their necks ache. They rub the bronze feet of the St. Peter statue, worn smooth by generations of desperate devotion. They believe they are witnessing the pinnacle of history, the absolute center of the Church. But they're missing the story directly under their feet, because deep beneath the polished marble, in the heavy, humid air of the scavi, lies a foundation that contradicts everything the Vatican tells us. We are going down there today, not to see the gold, but to look at the stone, at engineering that feels almost alien to the site. The official story is a tidy, linear path from the 1st century, but the physical evidence suggests something much darker, that this monument wasn't built just to sanctify a grave. It was built to bury a rival. Today, we're investigating the systematic erasure of pagan history beneath St. Peter's. The light in St. Peter's Square is blinding, isn't it? It's warm, it's noisy, it's vibrant, but the moment you slip away from that sunlight and begin the descent into the scavi, the shift is jarring. You trade the manicured, polished marble of the Basilica floor for something else entirely. The air down here is heavy, almost thick, like it hasn't moved in centuries. The word secretum, in its original Latin, did not carry the weight of something sinister or forbidden. It simply meant private, a quiet, closed space. But, and here is the thing, when that word was applied to the Vatican's archival system, it created a linguistic trap that has shielded the Apostolic Archives for centuries. The reality of the place is far more physical than the name implies. If you consider that the Apostolic Archives house roughly 85 kilometers of shelving, enough paper to span the distance from London to Brighton, the term private starts to feel like a massive understatement, perfect for creating an air of mystery. This isn't just storage, it is a filter. Today, we're looking at how a repository of this magnitude functions less like a library and more like a mechanism for engineering a historical legacy. We are not just exploring files, we are examining how the past is curated, weaponized, and eventually released only when the timing aligns with institutional stability. To understand the Vatican, you have to understand that history here stops being a record and starts being a script. The Apostolic Archives occupy a subterranean fortress beneath the Vatican, a labyrinthine space where the air is kept thin and cold to prevent the decay of parchment and papyrus. It smells, by all accounts, of dust, metallic shelving, and centuries of preserved intent. But the physical volume, the sheer amount of paper, is secondary to the access protocols. You cannot simply walk into the Apostolic Archives. There is no public reading room or card catalog for the casual browser. The access requirements are a bureaucratic gauntlet. You need a letter of introduction from an accredited research institution and a doctorate-level academic focus. You are vetted, assessed, and scrutinized before you are even permitted to request a single file. And when you are finally inside, you realize the true nature of the barrier. It is not just about who gets in. It is about what you are allowed to ask for. It is a system built on controlled transparency, which brings us to the Knights Templar. For 700 years, the official narrative held that this order was a cabal of heretics, disbanded and destroyed in the early 14th century for sorcery and apostasy. The Church codified this guilt. That was the history. But in 2007, the Vatican released the Chinon Parchment. This document, which had been resting in the archives for 7 centuries, provided absolute proof that the Pope had, in fact, absolved the Templars of all heresy in 1308. They were innocent. The Church held the acquittal while the history books wrote the conviction. This is the fundamental paradox of the Apostolic Archives. They do not just store history, they hold it hostage until its release serves a purpose. The 2019 decision to rename the Secret Archives to the Apostolic Archives was a masterclass in public relations. It addressed the modern discomfort with the word secret, but it did little to dismantle the restrictive access model. The Church maintains that they have embraced openness, pointing to the digitization and increased availability of collections, particularly from the era of Pope Pius XII during the Second World War. On the surface, this looks like a move toward total historical transparency. But here is the critical distinction. The existence of a file does not mean the completeness of a record. Researchers digging into the Pius XII era have frequently encountered frustrating gaps in the correspondence. When an archive is this meticulous, when the preservation standards are this high, the missing file is rarely an accident. It is a choice. By selecting what is released, and by extension what remains sequestered, the Church manages its own narrative, steering the historical conversation away from uncomfortable questions about complicity or political maneuvering. This isn't just preserving the past, it is editing the future. When you control the flow of documents, you control the historical verdict. This forces a shift in perspective. Are we looking at a religious institution preserving sacred history, or are we staring at the world's oldest, most efficient PR firm? The evidence suggests that the Vatican manages its memory with a level of rigor that would make a government intelligence agency jealous. If the archive functions as a filter, then the history we think we know might just be the version that the institution has decided is safe for public consumption. That brings us to the uncomfortable question that persists long after you leave the vaults. If the Vatican can hold an acquittal for 700 years, and if they can curate the records of the Second World War to favor institutional neutrality, what else is waiting behind those locked doors? Is the 2019 rebranding a genuine step into the light, or is it merely an adjustment to the optics of power? The archives stand as a testament to the idea that knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge is power, and the Vatican has spent centuries ensuring that the power to define the past remains firmly in their hands. As long as those 85 kilometers of shelves remain behind a gatekeeper, history will always be a curated narrative, not an objective truth.